All right, let's dive into a really fascinating logical puzzle. It's known as the unbreakable chain. It's an argument that actually uses the Quran's own words to build a case about the Torah's reliability, and it leads to a conclusion that, well, it creates a pretty profound dilemma for faith. Let's see exactly how this chain is forged.
So we're going to tackle this almost like a detective working a case. First, we'll set the scene by looking at the central question of corruption. Then, we're going to call up a series of witnesses, all from within the Quran itself. After that, we'll examine the hard physical evidence, the ancient manuscripts. Then, we'll stress test the whole case by looking for any possible escape routes. And finally, we'll face the tough dilemma that this whole investigation uncovers.
You know, at the very heart of this whole thing is this powerful courtroom analogy. It's not about finding one single piece of evidence. No, it's about a chain of testimony, where each piece reinforces the last. As each witness gets up and confirms what the previous one said, the case just gets stronger and stronger and harder to dismiss.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. To really get why this argument is so powerful, we first have to understand the problem it's trying to solve, a really critical question about the integrity of the biblical text.
So, what's this all about? Well, it centers on this concept of tahrif. That's the Islamic belief that the original texts of the Torah and the Gospels were changed over time. The unbreakable chain argument comes right at this claim, head-on. But here's the twist. It doesn't use outside evidence to do it. It looks at what the Quran itself has to say about it.
And that brings us to the big question, what the argument calls the master key to this whole puzzle. Can the Torah that we have in our hands today actually be trusted? The answer, whichever way you go, has some massive theological implications and creates a really difficult puzzle to solve.
Okay, so now we get to the real meat of the argument. It's time to call the witnesses to the stand. And these witnesses, they're not some external sources. They are specific verses right from the Quran, and each one has testimony to give about the Torah. What you're seeing here isn't just a list of names. The argument is that the Quran itself builds this unbroken chain of trust in the Torah. It claims it stretches all the way from Moses, right through centuries of prophets, gets reaffirmed by Jesus, and is still considered valid in the time of Muhammad. These right here are the 5 foundational links in this chain of testimony. And you got to notice the pattern here. It's not just a random collection of verses. The argument is that each link is strategically placed. It starts with the Torah's divine origin, from Allah, boom. Then it locks down the next 1,500 years by saying prophets used it for judgment. Then it seals the period around Jesus by having him confirm the text he had. Then it moves to the 7th century and confirms the text available then contains Allah's judgment. And finally, it commands believers to uphold it. You see, each statement is like a link designed to seal off a specific period of history, making it harder and harder to find a time when some widespread corruption could have snuck in.
This verse, Surah 5:44, it's a huge link in the chain, locking down a massive chunk of history. And it all boils down to a really powerful theological question. In Islam, prophets are considered ma'sum, right? Sinless, divinely protected from error. So the question is, would these divinely guided men use a corrupted, man-made book as their ultimate guide for justice for over 1,000 years? The phrase judged by it is presented as solid proof of the Torah's integrity through that whole era.
Now this is where you really got to look closely at the wording. Surah 5:43 uses the present tense. It's talking about the Torah that the Jews have in their possession, right then and there in the 7th century. And it calls that accessible text the judgment of Allah. This isn't talking about some mythical, long-lost original scroll. It's talking about the physical books people were actually reading at the time.
And this brings up a fascinating point about the language itself. The argument points out that when the Quran talks about the Torah, it consistently uses the word musaddiq. This word means to confirm as true. What's really interesting is the words it doesn't use. It avoids words that would mean to correct, or to replace, or to cancel the text. This specific choice of words is framed as a very deliberate, very powerful affirmation. All right, so we've heard the testimony from the text. Now the case shifts to what you might call the forensic evidence. We're moving from witnesses to hard physical proof, the ancient manuscripts of the Torah themselves.
So we've got 3 main witnesses here when it comes to the manuscripts. And what's so incredible is that these groups were not friends. You have the Dead Sea Scrolls from a Jewish community, preserved in caves centuries before the Quran. You've got the Septuagint, a Greek translation that's even older. And then there's the Samaritan Pentateuch, kept by a rival community that had split from Judaism centuries before Jesus and were frankly hostile to them. They had absolutely no reason to get together and coordinate their texts.
And this is where it gets really interesting. When you take these separate, even hostile manuscript traditions and compare them on core theological ideas, like was it Isaac or Ishmael who was the son of the covenant, they all tell the exact same story. Every single one points to Isaac. The argument here is that the only way these rival groups could agree is if they were all drawing from the same stable and unchanged original text.
It's like that other courtroom analogy we talked about. Imagine a crime happens, right? And the police bring in 3 witnesses to testify. They all live in different cities, they don't know each other, there's no way they could have talked, but when the judge asks each one what they saw, they all tell the exact same story. What's the logical conclusion? They're telling the truth. And that's exactly how this argument frames the evidence from these independent manuscripts.
Okay, so the chain looks pretty solid, right? But is it really unbreakable? Now's the part where we try to break it. We have to look at the counter-arguments, which are framed here as escape routes. Basically, possible gaps in the timeline where corruption could have happened. Let's put them to the test. All right, let's check out the first common escape route, the idea that the Torah was corrupted before Jesus. If that's true, it means for 1,500 years the Jews were following a changed book. The argument counters this by pointing right back to Quran 5:44. It asks again, would sinless, divinely guided prophets have judged by a corrupted text for 15 centuries? The argument says no, that's a theological impossibility. So that escape route is sealed. Okay, what about the next one? Maybe it was corrupted after Jesus, but before Muhammad in that 600-year window. This is a popular claim, but again, the chain points to the Quran's own words, Surah 5:43, calling the Torah that was physically there in the 7th century the judgment of Allah. That verse, the argument says, slams that window shut. So that brings us to a third escape route. Maybe the corruption happened after Muhammad's time. This is where that forensic manuscript evidence is so crucial. We literally have physical copies of the Torah, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, that were sealed away centuries before the Quran was even revealed. And when you compare those ancient texts to the Torah we have today, they're the same on all the major stories. This physical evidence makes a post-7th century corruption pretty much impossible, according to the argument. That leaves one last, more philosophical escape route, the idea that the Quran only confirms some lost, perfect, original Torah, not the one people actually had. But the argument refutes this by pointing to the Quran's specific grammar, that present tense language. It talks about the book with you, the scripture that they have, what they are reading. That language points to a real tangible book, not some long-lost idea. So after walking through all the testimony, checking the forensic evidence, and even trying to find a way out, we arrive at the final and, frankly, very challenging conclusion. This is what the argument presents as a profound theological dilemma.
And here it is, the stark conclusion of the unbreakable chain. The argument is that the Quran itself confirms the reliability of the Torah, and the manuscript evidence confirms that the Torah's text is stable. But that very same text contains stories that directly contradict foundational Islamic beliefs. Let's just break this dilemma down step by step so it's crystal clear. 1. The Quran says the Torah people have is reliable. 2. The manuscripts prove the Torah we have today is that same book. 3. That same book teaches the covenant came through Isaac, not Ishmael. And 4. This creates a direct contradiction. The Quran appears to confirm a book whose text challenges its own narratives. That's the logical tension at the heart of this. Now, proponents of this argument often point to this specific verse from the Quran to frame the whole discussion. They claim the goal isn't to attack, but to present a sincere investigation of the evidence, to encourage a search for truth above everything else.
And that leaves us right here, with a big, tough question that this argument forces you to ask. If this chain of testimony from the Quran and evidence from the manuscripts really is unbreakable, then something has to give. So which is it? The reliability of the Torah we have today, or the Quran's testimony about it?